The sun was barely rising over the small western town when the laughter began. It echoed down the dirt streets, cruel and careless, bouncing off saloon walls and shop doors still shuttered for the morning. The lonely lumberjack stood there, his hands rough and scarred, clutching a small bundle wrapped in paper. 2 handmade dolls he had carved himself. It was Father's Day, though for him, that title had never been spoken. The townsfolk saw him as nothing more than a brute, a man without family, without purpose, without love. Yet they didn't know that those dolls weren't for himself, but for the twin girls who had changed his life. The jeers cut deep. "Who's going to call you Dad, old man?" One of the ranchers sneered. The lumberjack didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that words mean little in a world that only values appearances. His silence only fueled their laughter. They didn't see the quiet strength behind those calloused hands or the pain buried deep in those tired eyes. To them, he was a ghost of the frontier, a man destined to die alone, forgotten by the land and the people alike. But fate in the West has a way of humbling the proud and revealing the hearts of the quiet. As the laughter faded and the dust settled around his boots, the lumberjack turned to leave, his dignity intact though his heart ached. Each step away from town felt heavier, the sound of mockery echoing like gunfire behind him. He wasn't angry. He was used to cruelty. What broke him wasn't the words. It was the truth they almost spoke. Because once, he had wished for someone to call him Father, to look at him not with pity or fear, but with love. And though he didn't know it yet, that wish was about to come true in a way that would shake the entire town. Beyond the edge of the prairie, in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, 2 little girls waited for him. Their hair was golden as sunlight, their laughter pure as spring water. They weren't his by blood, but they had chosen him, the man everyone else had turned away from. He had found them months ago, lost and starving, their parents gone in a fire that took everything. Since then, he had built them a home with his own hands, teaching them to fish, to read, to live. He was rough and quiet, but his care was endless. To them, he was already their father. And on that very day, while the town laughed and mocked what they couldn't understand, destiny was preparing a lesson they would never forget. Because before the sun set on that Father's Day, the lonely lumberjack, mocked for his solitude and scorned for his silence, would hear the words he had longed for all his life. And when the twin girls called him Dad, the laughter of the town would die where it stood, replaced by a silence that only truth can command. For in the Old West, there are moments when the heart of a man proves stronger than all the cruelty the world can muster. The lumberjack walked the long road home beneath a sky painted in soft hues of gold and gray. His hands still held the small bundle of carved dolls, their wooden faces smoothed with care, each strand of hair etched with the precision of a man who worked not with haste, but with heart. Behind him, the echo of laughter trailed like a haunting melody, a sound he knew too well. Yet, with every step toward the cabin he had built deep within the pines, the ache in his chest began to ease. For there, beyond the reach of cruel eyes, waited the only light left in his world, 2 little girls who had turned his solitude into something sacred. When he reached the clearing, the sound of their laughter reached him first, soft, playful, unguarded. They were chasing each other between the tall trees, their small boots crunching against the pine needles, their giggles scattering like music across the forest. The moment they saw him, they ran toward him with arms outstretched, shouting his name. The pain of mockery faded instantly. They didn't care about what the town thought of him. To them, he wasn't a lumberjack or a loner. He was safety. He was home. He knelt as they reached him, 1 girl on each side, their hands eager to see what he had brought. "Close your eyes," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a warmth the world had long forgotten. They obeyed without hesitation, their faces lit with excitement. When they opened their eyes, he placed the dolls into their small palms. The girls gasped, their joy pure and unfiltered. "They look just like us," one exclaimed. "You even carved our ribbons," said the other. Their wonder filled the air, and for the first time that day, the lumberjack smiled. A real smile, one that reached his eyes. The girls threw their arms around him, their laughter mixing with the rustling of the pines. "Thank you, Dad," one whispered without thinking, her small voice trembling with sincerity. The word struck him harder than any insult ever could. He froze, every breath caught in his chest. It wasn't a word they'd ever used before, but in that moment, it felt like the world stopped turning. The second girl looked up, as if realizing what her sister had said, and smiled. "Yeah," she added, "you're our dad now." The lumberjack didn't speak. His throat tightened, his eyes stung with tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. The dolls fell softly into the snow as he pulled them both into his arms, holding them close, as if afraid they might vanish like a dream. In that fragile moment, the loneliness that had defined his life finally broke, replaced by something he had never dared to believe in: belonging. The morning after Father's Day dawned cold and quiet, but the cabin was alive with warmth. The girls had woken early, eager to make breakfast as a surprise. Pancakes that were more flour than batter filled the air with the scent of smoke and sweetness. The lumberjack sat at the table, pretending not to notice the mess as he watched them bustle about, their braids bouncing, their laughter filling the small wooden home. It was clumsy, chaotic, but it was perfect. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive, filled with the sound of family. He remembered a time, long ago, when he had sat alone at that same table, eating in silence, the only sound the creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots. Back then, his life had been work, sleep, and the dull rhythm of solitude. He had accepted loneliness as his punishment for something he could never forgive himself for: a wife lost to illness, a child that never came to be. But these two girls, so full of life and light, had given him something he never thought he'd deserve again: redemption. When they brought him their breakfast, a plate of burnt pancakes shaped like hearts, he laughed, a deep, genuine sound that startled even him. "It's perfect," he said, and meant every word. The girls beamed, their pride glowing brighter than the morning sun through the window. They didn't see his calloused hands or the roughness of his voice. They saw only the man who had stayed, who had built them a home when the world had taken everything else away. Later that day, as they walked together through the forest, the lumberjack taught them how to tell the age of a tree by its rings, how to find their way by the sound of running water, and how to listen when the wind spoke. The twins followed his every word, their curiosity endless. Watching them, he realized something that sent a quiet peace through his soul. The land had not only given him a reason to live, but a reason to love again. But as the sun dipped low beyond the mountains, a shadow crossed the lumberjack's mind. The world beyond the forest was cruel and unforgiving, and whispers traveled fast in small towns. He knew the laughter from yesterday wouldn't fade, it would grow. And one day, it might find its way up this mountain, twisting something beautiful into something they could use against him. The thought chilled him more than the winter wind ever could. He had finally found peace, but the West had a way of testing every man who dared to believe he deserved it. The days that followed passed quietly, but the lumberjack could sense an unease creeping at the edges of his peace. The forest, once his ally, now felt like it was listening, holding its breath before a storm he couldn't yet see. Down in town, the story had already begun to twist. The same men who mocked him on Father's Day now whispered darker words over their drinks at the saloon. They spoke of how a lonely hermit had taken in two little girls who weren't his own, of how something unnatural must be happening deep in those woods. Cruel minds always seek to poison what they do not understand. The lumberjack knew the world of men far too well to ignore the danger. He had seen how quickly gossip turned into hate, how a lie, once spoken, could grow sharper than any blade. But when he looked at the twins, one braiding the other's hair by the fire, both giggling at secrets only sisters shared, he felt something stronger than fear. He would not let them take this from him. He had lost everything once before. He would not lose them too. Not while there was still breath in his body and strength in his hands. One evening, as twilight bled into the trees, the girls sat with him by the fire. The older of the two asked softly, "Do you miss the town?" The lumberjack stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "No," he said finally, his voice low. "Towns forget kindness too quickly. But the forest remembers." The girls nodded, though they didn't fully understand. They leaned against him, their eyes growing heavy with sleep, their trust in him absolute. He sat there until the fire burned low, his heart both heavy and full. The next morning brought signs that peace was slipping away. Footprints, fresh and heavy, cut through the snow near the edge of his land. Boot tracks, not animal. The lumberjack followed them to the ridge and saw smoke rising far below. Too close, too deliberate. He felt the cold settle into his bones, not from the air, but from the knowledge that men had found their way to his doorstep. He returned to the cabin silently, his mind already preparing for what he knew would come. He spent the day sharpening his axe, not for wood this time, but for warning. The girls sensed something had changed, their laughter softer now, their eyes often searching his face for reassurance. That night, he tucked them in a bed and sat by the door, rifle in hand. Outside, the wind howled through the pines like a wounded spirit, and for the first time in years, the lumberjack prayed, not for himself, but for the strength to protect what he had been given. The storm broke 2 nights later. The forest, drenched in fog, seemed to shiver under the weight of approaching danger. The lumberjack heard them before he saw them. Horses snorting, boots crunching over frost, the low murmur of men who carried hate like fire in their hearts. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle slung across his chest, his shadow long against the cabin's flickering light. The men stopped at the edge of the clearing, 5 in total, their faces lit by lantern glow. Among them stood the rancher who had humiliated him on Father's Day. His smirk was gone, replaced by something colder, intent. "Well, look at that," the rancher sneered. The lonely lumberjack playing house with orphans. His words slithered through the air, meant to wound. The lumberjack didn't respond. His silence was steady, deliberate, the kind that made even the cruel hesitate. "You got no claim on those girls," another man said. "They ain't yours. We'll be taking them to town." The lumberjack's voice was calm, but there was iron beneath it. "You'll take nothing from this mountain," he said. "Not them. Not me. Not even a splinter of this wood." His gaze met the rancher's, and for the first time, the man faltered. There was something ancient in the lumberjack's eyes, something that didn't yield to threats or mockery. It was the look of a man who had already faced hell and walked back out alive. But cruelty, once unleashed, doesn't know when to stop. The rancher spat into the snow. "You think you can stop us?" he said, his hand resting on his gun. The lumberjack stepped forward, the crunch of his boots echoing like thunder in the stillness. "I don't think," he said quietly. "I know." The men tensed. For a moment, the forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Then came the sound, the soft creak of a window opening behind him. The twins, frightened but brave, peeked out from the cabin. "Dad," one of them whispered, her voice trembling. The word froze the air. The men stared, the rancher's sneer fading as realization struck. In that single word, "Dad," everything shifted. What they had mocked as loneliness was revealed for what it truly was. Love. Unbreakable, unashamed, and stronger than any lie they could tell. The lumberjack raised his rifle slowly, his voice low but steady. "You see, gentlemen," he said, "a man with nothing to lose is dangerous. But a father defending his children, that's something else entirely." The wind howled, and the standoff began. The first shot shattered the silence of the forest, tearing through the still night like thunder. The rancher had fired first, but his bullet struck only the wooden post beside the lumberjack's head. In one swift motion, the lumberjack returned fire, his rifle roaring like a storm breaking against the mountains. One of the men cried out, dropping his weapon and collapsing into the snow. The others scrambled for cover, their courage faltering in the face of a man who moved not with anger, but with purpose, calm, deliberate, unyielding. Inside the cabin, the twins clung to each other, their wide eyes reflecting the glow of the fire and the flashes of gunfire outside. Every shot felt like a blow to their small hearts, every silence between them a breath held too long. Yet, even through their fear, they understood something deeper than words. The man they called Dad wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to protect. That truth, though terrifying, filled them with pride. Outside, the lumberjack moved like the forest itself, silent, sure, and impossibly strong. He knew every shadow, every angle of the land. When one of the men tried to flank him, a single swing of the axe ended the attempt. Another charged, yelling curses, only to be met with the butt of the rifle and the hard truth of his own cowardice. The rancher, seeing his men falter, cursed under his breath and drew his pistol again. He had mocked this man for years, called him weak, pitted his solitude. But now, face to face with him in the frozen dark, he realized too late what the West always teaches. Real strength doesn't shout. It endures. "Stop!" The lumberjack's voice cut through the gunfire, raw and commanding. "You came here thinking I was alone, but I'm not alone anymore. You wanted to break a man's peace. You'll answer to a father's wrath." His words hung heavy in the air, and even the wind seemed to pause. The men hesitated, glancing toward the trees, as if the forest itself might turn against them. The rancher's eyes burned with humiliation. He raised his pistol again, hand shaking, and fired, once, twice. The shots rang out, echoing through the pines. The rancher's breath came in ragged gasps, his arrogance unraveling as he watched the lumberjack step forward, unfazed, his shadow swallowing the light from their lanterns. He didn't need to fire back. He didn't need to kill. His silence alone was enough to break them. One by one, the men backed away, dragging their wounded and their pride with them. The forest closed behind them like a gate, and the clearing fell still again. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded, the lumberjack lowered his rifle and exhaled. The snow around him was marked with the scars of battle, but his spirit stood untouched. He turned toward the cabin, where two small faces pressed against the window, their eyes wide and glistening. He walked slowly, each step heavy with exhaustion and relief. When he opened the door, the twins ran to him, their tiny hands gripping his coat, their tears soaking his shirt. "We thought you were gone," one whispered. "Not today," he said softly, his voice trembling as he pulled them close. "Not while I still breathe." He sank to his knees beside the hearth, the firelight flickering across his worn face. The girls clung to him, refusing to let go. For a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the slow rhythm of their breathing, sinking together like one heart finding its way back from fear. He had faced more than just men that night. He had faced the ghosts of his past, the shame of solitude, the wound of being unloved. And for the first time, he felt the weight lift. When the girls finally pulled away, one of them looked at him with a seriousness far beyond her years. "You didn't have to fight for us," she said quietly. "We're not your real family." The words pierced him, but before the ache could take hold, he smiled, gentle, sure, and full of meaning. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. And that's something no man can steal." The girls nodded slowly, and one laid her head against his chest. "Then you really are Dad," she whispered. He chuckled softly, his eyes glistening. "Always have been." The next morning, the forest greeted them with sunlight filtering through the trees. Birds sang again, as if the land itself was blessing their peace. The girls helped him gather the fallen branches from the night before, giggling as they carried firewood almost too heavy for their small arms. Life resumed, not untouched, but unbroken. The lumberjack knew the town would talk, would twist the truth into something cruel. But he also knew that some truths don't need defending. They live quietly in the heart, where gossip can't reach. And as he watched the twins chase each other through the snow, the lumberjack felt something he hadn't known since his youth: contentment. The West was still wild, still harsh, still unforgiving. But here, in this small clearing, surrounded by laughter and love, it had also become something else entirely. It had become home. The thaw of spring came early that year, as if even the land itself wished to start anew. Meltwater ran in soft streams down the hillsides, washing away the last stains of winter's battles. The lumberjack spent his days teaching the girls how to plant seeds in the thawed soil, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder as he showed them how to press the earth just right. "You have to talk to it," he told them, half smiling. "The land listens better when you speak with kindness." The girls giggled but obeyed, whispering to the ground as though sharing secrets with the earth. The laughter of the twins filled the valley, blending with the hum of bees and the whisper of pines. For the first time in years, the lumberjack allowed himself to rest. He mended his tools, rebuilt the fence, and even sang quietly while working, a sound the forest hadn't heard since his wife had passed long ago. He never told the girls about her. But sometimes, when he looked at them chasing butterflies near the creek, he saw in them the gentleness she once carried. The ache of loss remained, but it no longer ruled him. It had become something softer, like the memory of a storm after it's passed. Down in the town, however, stories began to shift. The same men who once mocked him now spoke of him in low tones. Some called him dangerous, others noble. Rumors twisted between fear and admiration. Mothers warned their sons to leave the lumberjack and his girls alone, while fathers nodded silently, knowing deep down that every man dreams of defending something pure. Truth has a strange way of spreading in the West. It grows slower than lies, but it takes deeper root. One afternoon, as the sun turned gold across the ridge, the twins asked him to go back to town. "We want to show everyone our home," one said brightly. The lumberjack paused, his axe frozen mid-swing. For a long moment, he said nothing. The memory of that cruel laughter, the humiliation on Father's Day, still echoed in his bones. But then he looked at them, their eyes full of innocence and pride, and he realized the truth. Running from the past only gives it power. Facing it turns pain into peace. He wiped the sweat from his brow, exhaled slowly, and nodded. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow we ride." That night, as the girls slept, he sat by the fire sharpening his blade, not in preparation for violence, but out of habit. The flames danced in his eyes as he thought of what awaited them. He wasn't the same man the town had mocked. The world could call him what it wished, but he knew who he was now, a father, in every way that mattered. Outside, the wolves howled, and instead of dread, he felt only resolve. Tomorrow would be the day the West remembered what it meant to stand tall, no matter the scars. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that felt like the world was holding its breath for something important. The lumberjack hitched the old wagon, the twins perched in the back, their dresses clean and hair tied with matching ribbons. As they descended the mountain path, birds followed overhead, as if guiding them. The air smelled of pine and promise, and though his heart beat hard in his chest, the lumberjack rode with his head high. He had faced storms, bullets, and loss. What was the judgment of men compared to that? When they reached the town, conversation stopped. The sight of the towering lumberjack leading the wagon down Main Street was enough to still even the loudest gossip. The same saloon that had once mocked him stood quiet, the same men who had laughed now lowering their gaze. The twins didn't notice the stares. They waved at everyone they saw, their smiles brighter than the morning sun. Their innocence disarmed the entire town. Even the cruelest among them couldn't meet the eyes of the man they had tried to humiliate. He guided the wagon to the center square, where the same Father's Day banners from months ago now hung faded and torn. The girls hopped down and ran to the fountain, their laughter ringing through the still air. For a moment, all the lumberjack heard was their joy, pure, unafraid, unbroken. Then, from across the street, a familiar voice called out, "Didn't expect to see you back here." The rancher sneered, though his words carried less venom than before. The lumberjack met his gaze steadily. "You didn't expect me to stay standing, either," he said simply. The tension hung heavy until one of the twins tugged at the rancher's sleeve. "Mister," she said softly, holding up the wooden dollar Father had carved, "our dad made this for us." The rancher blinked, caught off guard. "Your dad?" he stammered. The girl nodded proudly. "He takes care of us. He teaches us things. He's the best dad in the world." Her words fell like stones into a still pond, rippling through the silence. The crowd turned their eyes to the lumberjack, once a man mocked for being alone, now standing surrounded by the proof of his love. The rancher stepped back, shame reddening his face. Around him, others began to look away, their whispers soft but filled with something new, respect. The lumberjack didn't smile or boast. He simply placed a hand on each of the girls' shoulders and said, "Let's go home." As they climbed back onto the wagon, a few townsfolk raised their hats in quiet acknowledgement. No one laughed this time. No one dared. The lesson had been carved into the heart of the West itself. A man is not measured by what he's lost, but by who he chooses to stand for when the world turns cruel. And as the wagon rolled out of town, the twins waved from the back, their little voices calling out to those who had once mocked them. Goodbye, they sang. The lumberjack didn't look back, but a faint smile crossed his face. He knew they would talk about this day for years to come. Not because a man returned to prove himself, but because, for once, the West had witnessed something rarer than gold. It had seen love, raw, pure, and defiant, win over pride. The road back home stretched long and quiet beneath the evening sky, painted in streaks of amber and rose. The twins had fallen asleep in the wagon, their heads resting against each other, their small hands still clutching the wooden dolls he'd made. The lumberjack drove slowly, his thoughts drifting between past and present, between the pain he had endured and the peace he had found. He glanced once more toward the horizon where the town had faded behind him. It no longer haunted him. The ghosts of shame and mockery were gone, replaced by something steady and calm. For the first time in years, he felt free. As the mountains rose around them, the air grew colder, carrying the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. The sound of the wagon wheels against the dirt became a rhythm, like a heartbeat echoing against the hills. He looked up toward the sky, where the first stars began to flicker awake. You were right, he murmured softly, thinking of his late wife, his voice carried by the wind. They needed someone to stay, and I needed someone to love. His words disappeared into the wilderness, but somehow the rustling trees seemed to answer in kind, a quiet acknowledgment from the land itself. When they reached the clearing, the cabin glowed warm in the darkness. The lumberjack carried the twins inside, tucking them into their beds with the same care he gave every piece of what he'd ever shaped. He lingered for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from one girl's face. In their peace, he saw everything he had fought for, the reason he had endured ridicule, danger, and loneliness. All of it led to this. 2 children safe, asleep under a roof built not of logs, but of love. He sat by the fire afterward, staring into the flames as they danced and cracked. His hands were rough, his shoulders scarred, but his heart no longer bore the weight it once did. The laughter of the town, the cruelty of men, it all felt distant now, meaningless. What mattered was here, in this cabin, in the echo of small footsteps and the sound of laughter that still lingered in the air. He had spent half his life searching for redemption in solitude, only to find it in the eyes of 2 little girls who called him Dad. Outside, the night deepened, the forest alive with the song of crickets and the whisper of the wind. He smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair, his mind at ease. The world was still wild, still cruel, but within the walls of this home, something gentler had taken root. The West, he realized, wasn't just a place of dust and blood. It was a place where broken men could rise again, where love could grow out of sorrow. And as the firelight flickered over his face, the lonely lumberjack no longer looked lonely at all. The seasons turned, as they always did in the West. The snows melted, the rivers swelled, and the forest came alive once more. Life settled into a rhythm, steady, peaceful, full. The twins grew taller, stronger, their laughter carrying farther across the valley. They learned the ways of the woods from him, the language of the trees, the secrets of the wind, the patience of the earth. To the outside world, he was still the lumberjack of the mountains. But here, to these 2 bright souls, he was something far greater. He was a father. Every so often, travelers passing through would stop by his clearing, asking for water, a meal, or a story to warm the night. The lumberjack never spoke of the battle or the mockery, never told them about the town that had once scorned him. Instead, he spoke of the land, of how the forest teaches a man to listen, of how even the tallest trees begin as fragile seeds. The twins would sit beside him, their eyes wide, their hands clutching their dolls as if holding the past close. When the travelers left, they always looked back, carrying with them the strange, quiet feeling that they had met something eternal. Years later, when the twins became young women, they still called him Dad, with the same affection as the day they first spoke the word. He would watch them from the porch as they worked the garden, their laughter echoing through the woods, and his heart would swell with pride. He never told them how much that single word had saved him, that it had mended what war, grief, and loneliness had broken. In their love, He found a redemption he once believed he'd lost forever. One evening, as the sun sank low, the twins brought him to the ridge overlooking the valley. "We want to show you something," one said. There, they'd built a small wooden bench carved with his initials. "So you can rest here and watch the world you built," the other added softly. The lumberjack sat down, his eyes glistening as he looked out across the valley. The same land that had once mocked him, now shining in golden light. "This world built us," he said quietly. "I just held it together long enough for you to grow." And as the wind swept gently through the pines, the lumberjack leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The laughter of the twins surrounded him, warm and pure. The land had finally given him peace. No parades, no glory, just the quiet joy of knowing that, in the end, love had won. In the heart of the Old West, where pride and pain often buried men whole, one lonely lumberjack had found what so many never did. Not riches, not recognition, but the simple, everlasting grace of being called Dad. The mountains stood quiet beneath the sunset, their peaks glowing like embers as the day drew its final breath. The lumberjack sat on the wooden bench his daughters had built, his eyes tracing the horizon where gold faded into blue. Around him, the forest whispered with life. The same forest that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with peace. He thought of the road he had walked, the ridicule, the pain, the silence, and realized it had all led here, to this moment of stillness, surrounded by love he never thought he'd deserve. What began as a life of exile had become a story of grace, carved by kindness and bound by courage. He remembered the laughter of the townsfolk, the sting of their mockery on that distant Father's Day, and he almost smiled. They had called him a fool, a man without purpose. Yet now, years later, he saw the truth. Their laughter had only tested his resolve. The West has its own way of shaping men. It strips away pride, exposes pain, and demands that one rise not through wealth or words, but through heart. The man they once mocked had become a father not by blood, but by choice, and in the end, that choice had written his redemption. As twilight deepened, the twins joined him on the ridge, their laughter still as pure as when they were little. They sat beside him in silence, each holding one of the old wooden dolls he had carved years ago. The wood was worn and faded, but the love it represented was eternal. "Do you ever miss the life you had before us?" one of them asked softly. The lumberjack's eyes glistened in the fading light. "Before you," he said, "I was only surviving. After you, I learned what living truly meant." His words hung in the air, carried by the wind like a prayer the mountains would remember forever. The sun sank completely, leaving behind a sky full of stars. In their glow, he saw reflections of every moment, the fear he'd conquered, the home he'd built, the love he'd nurtured from ashes. His story was not one of strength alone, but of transformation, from a man defined by loss to one defined by love. And perhaps that's the lesson the West always meant to teach, that true fatherhood, true purpose, isn't given by the world approval, but by the quiet acts of love that endure long after the world has stopped watching. And as this story fades into the dusk, it leaves a question burning softly in the heart. How many lonely souls are still waiting for someone to call them dad, mom, or simply home? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like these live on when they're felt, remembered, and spoken aloud. Subscribe to the channel and help keep the spirit of the Old West alive, where courage still whispers through the wind, love still rides against the odds, and every broken heart has the power to build something beautiful again.